All right, so we got 2 chapters left to go here in AP World History for the 2021 school year. So, for Chapter 37, The End of Empire, we're talking about decolonization and also putting it in the context of the Cold War. So, how is this affecting areas of Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East or North Africa? We're combining those two areas. South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Africa, and also Latin America. So, very encompassing. So, we're going to cover this in a few videos here. To explain the historical context of the Cold War after 1945, comparing the ways in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union sought to maintain influence over the course of the Cold War, so pairing in those ideas. Coming back and talking further about the causes and consequences of China's adoption to communism, especially looking at reactions in China and to efforts to industrialize, successes and failures of that. Explaining the causes and effects of movements to redistribute economic resources. So again, that'll be very impactful in terms of, again, China, but also within Africa. Explaining how political changes, this can continue on one from 1900 to the present led to territorial, demographic, and nationalistic developments. Explaining the economic changes and continuities resulting from the process of decolonization, and then explaining the reactions to existing power structures in the period after 1900. So again, a lot of this tying into the Cold War and the ideas of decolonization. So what we want to take away from and hopefully understand into the context and understanding of this chapter, okay, understanding the role that World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War, coming up a lot, had in advancing economic, social, and political reasons for decolonization, both of land and also the money empires. So thinking about this in terms of neocolonialism and corporations and businesses and their impacts on decolonization in Asia and Africa. So we have to understand that this also reinforced the ideas of self-determination starting back from World War I and even so beyond that with nationalistic movements. And that for a lot of these places around the globe, so think about the British, the French, the Dutch, the Italians, it becomes a lot harder to control these areas with limited money, limited numbers of people, and as coming into the idea of following World War II and the economic hardships that follow the war, as well as following from World War I and the Depression, but also the consistent calls for independence and democracy that have been growing for decades in the face of growing communist sentiments, because if the democracies are saying we believe in freedom, we believe in civil liberties, we believe in sovereignty and self-determination, and we're saying that against the communists, but the communists can say, well, you also have a bunch of people, like millions of people under your control in Asia and Africa, and in the United States, you're not even treating a very large chunk of your population fairly, granting them equal rights with segregation. So those are concepts and ideas to understand. For what helps to also push forward decolonization is the fact that we're in the midst of a Cold War, and if things do not go well, they might side themselves with the communists or communist turns and movements in order to, again, gain independence. So that is something to understand. We also want to compare how countries and regions became independent. So in particular, how certain countries or certain regions became independent. When did they become independent? So what years? How long did it take? As well as the issues that they faced afterwards, especially, again, the ideas of what we call like normal colonies or colonies that didn't have a whole lot of Europeans or European descendants versus settler colonies like particularly Kenya and South Africa. All right, and again, looking again into the economics, the social, political aspects that they faced in relation to the Cold War following decolonization. And we want to also consider the role that Europe had in creating their boundaries, who was in them. So again, the religious and ethnic differences. So again, this comes into play a lot within Africa in particular. Favoritisms that the Europeans played to certain groups over others. Then also considering who owned the best land. And that, again, this idea tying back to neocolonialism. So white settlers, businesses, corporations, the wealthy, the military, who owned the best land industries, and how does that affect, again, the development? Again, so tying in back to continuing role of neocolonialism, from Europe and the U.S. on former colonies or throughout other parts of the developing world, or what we consider the developing world. The rise of Arab nationalism, especially issues regarding Israel and Palestine and regional conflict, and the rise of Islamism and its impacts, and we'll connect back to that in the next chapter. But also, again, tying into one of our main talking points here, Communist China and the successes and failures of the Communist Chinese Party through the 60s and 70s, because in the 80s and 90s, they take a very big turn in terms of their economic policies. So looking at decolonization, so in many cases, some of this starts before the end of World War II. So looking at Iraq, Egypt, even Syria is during the war. But a lot of countries, again, it even takes all the way up through the 70s in many cases. like Djibouti breaking off from, Djibouti in 1977, but a lot of them in the 50s and 60s. And again, you can kind of see where those patterns are within certain countries. For the French, it's mostly in the 60s, early 60s. For the British, it's mostly in the late 50s, early 60s. Italy, 51 and 60. And so, yeah, and a whole bunch of reasons behind what's going on in these different places. Like if you look at here in France, okay, Vietnam became independent in 1954 following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, and we'll talk about that. But Algeria, which also goes through a massive war for independence against France, starting pretty much at the same time that their war in Vietnam ends, it takes another 8 years of fighting for it. So, again, things to consider. We also want to put this in context, again, of the Cold War. So looking at Cold War points of conflicts, not necessarily battles, but definitely areas where we saw interventions, where we saw supports, where we saw a lot of things going on. So like Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, U.S. interventions in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua in the late 80s, Grenada in the 80s. We don't even see Chile down here, but that's another area point of interest. Egypt, which we'll talk about this chapter, Greece and Turkey, which we talked about last chapter, and then also Afghanistan, which we'll talk about the next one, Iran, which we'll talk about this one, and then you can kind of see all the stuff going on in Asia. So a lot of other things happening in the decolonized world, or the world as it's decolonizing, inside of these territories. So the first case study, and this will probably be where we're going to wrap up with this first video, is talking about self-rule in India, but also talking about the third way as well, is the partition of India. So this has been something we've brought up a number of times, starting back with even the imperialism conversation in chapter 32, and how this kind of helped lead to the beginnings of nationalist movements in a place like India, considered the crown jewel of what was left of the British Empire at the end of the 1800s. So India has been slowly moving towards independence. They have been, a lot of their leaders have been Western educated by the British, or at least through English schools, or have studied abroad. And so the Indian National Congress has been pushing for independence for a very, very long time. And so while for the most part they're trying to go through this through nonviolent, peaceful means under, the likes of, Mahatma Gandhi, we unfortunately see a lot of pushback from the British, again, following especially World War I, at the, massacre at Amritsar, and a few other places. But, they're trying to do boycotts. They're trying to, again, become self-sufficient in the rising face of the British imperialism. All right, so they'd had limitations, they'd had a government, but again, still pretty much overseen by the British government, or by the British Empire. All right, so they'd had administrative roles, they had European education, and they'd also aided in the wars and industries as soldiers, as stretcher bearers, but also producing goods for the British. And also impactful, okay, the Burma Road, which was connecting goods and soldiers from India all the way into, Vietnam, but also into China to support their efforts, was really, really impactful in World War II, and you don't really hear about that unless you're studying particular parts of the war in the Pacific. So, the Indian National Congress, again, being predominantly Hindu, and the Muslim League are two organizations asking and fighting for independence, but again, mostly along religious lines. So someone like Mahatma Gandhi does not want that. He wants a unified India without the issue of religion, despite the fact that, Gandhi himself is a very devout Hindu, does not believe in those barriers, right? But there is religious mistrust over the era, but also the fact that the Hindus are the vast majority of the population within India, and so we're talking about wealthy landowners for the most part, who owns the most industries actually within India. For the most part, in most areas, belongs to Hindu people, and most of the laborers, in many cases, especially again in northern farms, are Muslim. And even that's true to today, even with just India, not just Pakistan. All right, so unfortunately, what we end up seeing is that distrust and the idea that if India was to become independent, Muslims felt that they were going to be essentially second-class citizens. And so this leads to, when independence is granted in 1947, that it is partitioned into essentially two parts. You have India, okay, which is predominantly Hindu, obviously still has a very large Muslim population, and then what you have in Pakistan being split into two areas, and eventually one of those becomes Bangladesh in the 1970s over ethnic issues, and also because while they're both Muslim countries, or predominantly Muslim, Bangladesh, there's a different ethnic group than the Pakistanis, and also the issue that the government stuff is in Pakistan, and big disaster, happens in Bangladesh with a massive tsunami in the early 70s, hence the concert for Bangladesh, leads to kind of their independence. But anyway, all right, so it's predominantly, the association is to be based along, for the most part, religious lines. All right, but this also leads to enforce or encourage migrations, with millions of people migrating between the newly created borders. Hence why you see these arrows here on this map. All right, and so there's a lot of violence between the mistrust, and also during the time with the movements. That still leads to tensions to this day. The fact that both countries have nuclear weapons pointed at each other, between India and Pakistan. About 500,000 to 1 million people had died during the migration and the related violence over those years. And then we also talked about, tens of millions of people who, or about 10 million people who were, encouraged or forcibly moved as a result. So, once India became independent, they began to focus on lessening their connections to Europe and European industries to build up their own. So this is not what Gandhi wanted, by the way, or at least, let me rephrase that. I don't know if I have that right. But anyway, I have to look back at that. But for the most part, though, Gandhi believed in building up India and focusing, on, again, that unity. But again, Gandhi is killed shortly after independence. So they focused on the Green Revolution to become more agriculturally solvent in order to, again, produce for themselves. But, for the most part, again, still most of the farmers in India, a lot of them are very subsistence. Others are cash crop, export-based, and still a lot of them making very little money, right? And so one of the things that this was, or turned out for Gandhi, was one of the reasons he was kind of unliked by a lot of the, high caste Hindus, was the better treatment of women and also the untouchables and getting rid of the caste system, which, by the way, is now illegal in India. But again, it's still sort of a hush-hush kind of thing that some people still hold on very much to. So yeah, and that's just kind of our talk on India. So the last thing to wrap up is this piece here that also helps us to really understand Cold War politics, is the non-alignment movement, or also known as the third way or the third path. All right, so you have, your democratic countries with, things like NATO, and a lot of other treaty organizations. Like for the communists, it's the Eastern Bloc, and then, you have China and Vietnam and, North Korea sort of together. But for the most part, a lot of these newly independent countries that were former colonies did not want to necessarily align with either one. For some, it's trying to get independent, become more independent economically, politically, and socially from, people that they'd just gotten independence from. Others, it was about, trying to stay out of politics into the chance of getting into a war with, one massive power against another. So again, talking about India, trying to build up its own economy, its own way in the world, in the 50s and 60s, that's kind of their path. And that's led by Narahal Juru, or Juru Narahal, who was, the first president of India, leading this movement for these newly independent countries to become, again, non-aligned, right, and find a third path or a third way instead of joining either with the Western democracies or with, communist countries. And it didn't mean that you didn't have to be a democracy. It doesn't mean you have to be a military dictator. It's just choosing not to, be militarily or necessarily economically or politically associated with these groups, right? Then you take the other one, is that, or the other kind of path, is some are willing to get aid and assistance or trade with one or both groups in an attempt to play both sides off of one another, as we'll see with Egypt. Because Egypt actually starts off trying to be non-aligned, but they get aid from the Soviet Union and then switch to the United States, something we will talk about in the next video. So again, in this first one, we talked about now a non-alignment, we talked about the partition of India, and also putting hopefully some ideas here into the context of the Cold War and decolonization, right, with all that. So in the next video, what we're going to start off with, and here's your little preview, okay, is going to be the Vietnam War, and also then talking about communist China. So that is video number 2 for chapter 37 coming up.